En nombre de la Cátedra Alfonso Reyes, del Tecnológico de Monterrey y de las Jornadas Feministas, les damos la más cordial bienvenida. En esta cátedra celebramos el espíritu abierto, plural y diverso de Alfonso Reyes, profundamente humanista y profundamente solidario. Estamos hoy todas y todos profundamente emocionados de tener como invitada a una de las pensadoras más desafiantes, controvertidas e imprescindibles para comprender el feminismo contemporáneo. Muchas gracias a Judith Butler por aceptar de manera tan generosa esta invitación. Sabemos que hoy algunas mujeres han decidido retirarse de las redes sociales en apoyo al movimiento Un Día Sin Nosotras, que surgió hoy hace exactamente un año, el 9M, en el que una gran cantidad de mexicanas nos ausentamos de los espacios públicos, de las calles, de las escuelas, de las oficinas, de algunas fábricas, de los sitios de comercio, para mostrar con nuestra ausencia y nuestro silencio las profundas condiciones de desigualdad, de injusticia y de violencia en las que sobreviven millones de mexicanas en un país en el que cada día hay 11 mujeres asesinadas y 26 mujeres y niñas desaparecen diariamente. Hoy queremos honrar este movimiento Un Día Sin Nosotras y honrar también al movimiento Ni Una Menos, que ha hecho que cientos de miles de mujeres tomen las calles en diversas ciudades de toda América Latina y con ruido y con furia muestren que todas las vidas son importantes y que, como dice Judith Butler, todos los cuerpos importan. Y honramos estos movimientos conversando con quien nos ha enseñado que el pensamiento académico tiene que salir a la calle, que los muros de las universidades deben ser porosos para abrazar las causas sociales. Hoy Judith Butler nos hará una presentación sobre el feminismo para nuestro tiempo y después conversará con las profesoras Mariana Gabarrot y Dora Estela García, profesoras investigadoras de la Escuela de Humanidades y Educación del TEC de Monterrey, quienes han seguido muy de cerca la trayectoria intelectual de nuestra invitada desde el ya célebre y polémico libro El género en disputa hasta su más reciente libro que lleva el sugerente título Sin miedo. Tanto esta exposición de Judith Butler como la conversación se realizarán en inglés. Si ustedes quieren seguir la traducción simultánea, pueden hacerlo en el canal de Facebook de la Escuela de Humanidades y Educación del Tecnológico de Monterrey. Nuevamente agradezco a Judith Butler el estar esta tarde con nosotros y sobre todo el invitarnos a pensar juntos y actuar juntas. Muchas gracias, Judith Butler. El Tecnológico de Monterrey es su casa. Adelante.
Thank you very much. I am very honored to be here, and I thank you all for welcoming me. I wish that I could be there with you in person, close to you, talking with you, having a meal with you, walking on the street together, because then we would be thinking together and we would have some brief moment of living together, right, in the same time and place. I am hopeful that we will be able to do that relatively soon. I hope this is true. That depends if the pharmaceutical industries continue to charge too much money and deny certain countries access to the vaccine, right? So there's this deep question of social and economic inequality that meets us the minute we talk about hope or the future or vaccine or repair. So I'm mindful of that. I thought today I might talk to you briefly about feminism, about the feminist movement for our times. And perhaps I should start with the simple fact that I believe we are lucky to find ways to stay in communication with each other and our worlds through platforms such as these, that our current isolation is not our permanent state. It is rather a new point of departure for thinking about our relations with one another, the social form that we are building as we expand networks of care, the world we will be repairing, and the world that we are now tasked with imagining or reimagining. I think indeed we know that care has always been associated with women's work, but now in recent months and perhaps the entirety of the last year, we see that networks of care move us out of the household, move us out of the family, into the neighborhood, into the city, into the region, that our action in one part of the world affects people's lives in another part of the world. So perhaps what this pandemic has to offer us is a more expansive sense of our interdependency, the interdependency not just between nations or between cities or between households, but an interdependency that belongs to us by virtue of our status as living beings, embodied and living beings. What air do we breathe? We share the air. What surfaces do we share? All of the surfaces. How do we each depend on the earth and the survival and persistence of the earth? So much is now our common responsibility, perhaps also our global responsibility, that we have to think again about how to imagine ourselves as belonging to the same world, to a common world, and how that world is related to the earth upon which we depend, and the stopping of climate change and the destruction of ecosystems and biodiversity. I know that you know about this in Mexico even more acutely and knowledgeably than I do. At the same time that I think there is a chance to think about a new form of relationality, an interdependency that exceeds internationalism, that cannot be properly described by internationalism alone. I am very aware that in the last years, the attacks on feminism have become quite public and quite intense. And on the one hand, this is a continuation of a misogyny that has been with patriarchal cultures for the longest time. On the other hand, I think there is something very contemporary about the attacks on feminism. They are attacks as well on LGBTQI people, on trans people in particular. And the attacks on feminism have, I think, been a response to our success, to the various ways we have fought against sexual violence. We have fought for equal wages. We have fought to give women reproductive freedom. We have also fought for trans rights and for the right of all people, no matter how gender conforming or gender non-conforming, to walk down the street, to breathe easily in their worlds without fear of violence, without fear of stigmatization, without fear of discrimination. So when people ask me, oh, why be a feminist these days? Hasn't everything been accomplished that feminism wants to achieve. I always, of course, say no. It cannot be denied that women are disproportionately exposed to violence and hunger, that women are much more likely to be illiterate than men, and to suffer with the threat and reality of sexual violence against them more than most men do. Not all men, but most men. Similarly, some have criticized the ecological movement, the movement against ecological destruction, the movement against extractivism, as anti-market or as exaggerated or perhaps as naive. And yet the various movements that seek to save our planet from environmental destruction, especially those driven by youth, have become indisputably urgent. If we cannot save the earth from destruction, then we lose the conditions we require to live, to love, to struggle for justice, freedom, and equality. So I bring up the environmental movement because I believe that all social movements, including feminism, depend upon the movement to combat climate change and the destruction of habitats and ecosystems throughout the world. If we cannot be sustained by the planet, if we cannot sustain the planet, we will not have our struggles for justice, for equality, and for freedom. And of course, feminism is a strong movement. It's an incredible movement, but I think we also have to ask, is it a movement that is just for women? Or is it a movement to change the landscape of our gendered world? That is, to battle all forms of gender discrimination, including the discrimination against women. And I say this because it's very important to remember that feminism has always been involved in thinking about gender as a political category and as an historical category. In other words, what it meant to be a woman in 1910 is very different from what it means to be a woman now, and that depends on time and place, culture and language. But we track the shifts in the meaning of what it is to become or to be a woman. We are aware that women were not suitable for academic life at one point in time, and yet they are now exactly suitable, and in fact in leadership positions everywhere. What has happened? Well, the social category, the historical category of woman has changed so that it permits different meanings than what it permitted in the past. So we have depended on gender being an open category, subject to redefinition, which is why trans women are also women. They belong to the category of women. They must belong. And those who have assumed that women are only those assigned female at birth, who live out their social and historical life as women, that they are the only women, I think they close the category instead of opening it into something that might be hospitable, generous, capacious, open to the future meanings of what gender can be. I want also to say this, that perhaps as we think about interdependency, we think about the open and historical shifting character of the category of women, that we also ask ourselves what kind of idea of solidarity is implied by the concept of feminism. For instance, we say, and we are right to say, that feminism is a social movement. Feminist theory is an academic inquiry. The two are linked, but not exactly the same. But when we talk about feminism, that of course includes the insistence that women's lives have dignity and that trans lives bear dignity, that violence on the street or in the home from intimate men or strangers, or even from women or the police, is a radical injustice and must be opposed. Feminism is, in my view, not just a movement for women, but for all those who want to live in a world of radical equality, where we savor the independent, interdependent character of our lives. And that means changing life in the family, the workplace, the street, the factory, the field, and the square. Although we are told by some that the feminist movement will destroy civilization or the family or culture as we know it, we know that that is not a fair conclusion. To demand the transformation of all these sites of living, the house, the street, the place of employment, to demand that change so that all of these sites, these institutions, embody principles of radical equality. To do that, we need to seek to support a wide number of social movements and to show them that it is in their interest to accept the equality of women, the openness of gender, and the interdependency of our lives. So here I would just like to say that academic work is also important as we think about these concepts. When we say we are against violence, we also need to be able to say, what is violence? Where do we find it? What forms does it take? Is it always physical? Can it be symbolic? Can it be linguistic? When we say we are for gender justice, do we have a concept of justice? From what texts and what social movements, from what histories do we derive our idea of justice? And when we think about equality, are we thinking about the equality of every individual to one another? Or are we perhaps saying that we are equally dependent upon each other, that we are equally interdependent, that we are in fact characterized by our dependency on a wide range of life systems, environments, and ecologies, without which our lives would not be possible. Perhaps now is the time to rethink equality in terms of these fundamental relations. What does it mean not to have access to food or air, good air, or health conditions that are livable and that support people, especially in times of pandemic? We see how social inequality works to distribute the fundamentals of life unequally. But what that tells us is that we are all equally dependent on those requirements for life, and that we need to think of ourselves not as abstract individuals, but as embodied creatures who require each other and who flourish most clearly under conditions of equality. So to my critics or my skeptics who say, why still feminism? Why feminism now? Well, as we know, the struggle is not over. Literacy, I mentioned, violence, discrimination, poverty, rights to healthcare, political rights, including reproductive freedom. So in order then to struggle, we must ask ourselves, what kind of power do we wield? What kind of power do we want? Well, I would suggest perhaps reflecting briefly on the work of Ni Una Menos, the work of Veronica Gago in particular, on the concept of feminist potencia. Now, potencia in Spanish is not the same as potential in English. It's a difficult word to translate. It is movement, it is force, it is collectivity. And when we speak about potential, we are dealing with a form of power, or perhaps a form of counterpower, that is a process, one that does not come to an end through a specific realization of its aims in a time or place. It is an open-ended process. And as an open-ended process, it is also potencia, a form of desire, a form of desire, yes, but also a form of thought that is linked to the body, to desire, to bodies in their collectivity. One could say, oh, it's a life force. But maybe it is a force that emerges between bodies or between in the middle of collectivities as we act together. We might think, oh, we need to have a force in order to act. We need to have power in order to act. But sometimes in the very process of collective action, we find our force or we produce it for one another. It is created by bodies as they act together. This is why Gago writes that desire is a force and already a form of power, one that is generally not included in the typologies of power that we learn in political science classes, but that can change. That can change. I want also to suggest that what many of the Latin American feminist movements have taught the North and taught Europe and other countries as we watch you with your powerful, powerful movements, is that the feminist movement needs to be linked to the struggle against colonialism and continuing colonial power. It needs to be linked to the struggle against old and new forms of dispossession, including colonial extractivism, the displacement of indigenous peoples, and the extraction of minerals for the marketplace at the expense of the earth. So I would suggest that we also, as a feminist movement, have to be concerned with labor unions, or to have our place in those unions, or to produce forms of solidarity and collectivity that can struggle to make sure women are protected on the job, that they have rights and entitlements, including a pension, and that their health is protected, and that they themselves are paid equally to men. And of course, that both men and women make a livable wage, right? It won't do to be paid equally to men if nobody is making a good wage. It must be a livable, wage. I want to suggest maybe that as feminism becomes involved in the critique of neoliberalism, the long and violent history of colonial dispossession, patriarchal forms of state terrorism, the prison industrial complex, as feminism seeks to care for precarious workers and the indigenous, that all of this means that feminism is a way of linking with other groups, or showing that those links and those relationships are essential to what it is. It's not that feminism is over here and then there's labor rights and then there's the critique and opposition to continuing colonial violence. It is rather that the links among all of those movements is feminism. Feminism is a theory of solidarity. It is also, I would suggest, along with Ni Una Menos, a practice of solidarity. Now, of course, we don't say the entire left is feminism, and yet feminism must be part of the left for the left to be legitimate. A left that rejects feminism is illegitimate. So feminism must be there. How must it be there? Just represented as a single identity category or group among groups? Or is it a movement that has the power to illuminate our interdependency and formulate a practice of solidarity among groups? So this is where I believe the concept of interdependency can lead to an understanding of feminism as a theory and practice of solidarity, and can also bring us to understand how feminism works throughout the left. Finally, I would just say that it has always been the task of women to mourn. After war, women mourn. After the horrible dictatorships and the terrible killing, women mourn. As far back as Greek tragedy, it is women who are mourning. But I don't believe that it is the natural task of women to mourn. I think that we all of us, regardless of gender, must learn to practice a certain kind of mourning. In the United States, when the Black Lives Matter movement became so visible and so powerful over the summer months, we saw that everyone on the street was mourning because Black lives should not be destroyed so quickly and so brutally by the police. We also saw that all of those who were mourning were also demanding justice. So then the question for us, for feminist theory, is what is the relationship between mourning and justice? How is it that when we know what we have lost, and we know that we ought not to have lost it, that it was unjust that it was lost, that our ideas of justice can move from there, can emerge from there. Because why? Because a just world would be a world in which all lives would be considered equally valuable. The loss of any life would be, through police violence, would be absolutely unacceptable, and that radical equality of the living would be expressed both in our mourning and in our calls for justice. And I'm glad to talk with you more about all of this, but I think I've gone on perhaps long enough, and I will be very interested to hear from las profesoras, and I will now be quiet for a little while.
Gracias. Thank you very much. So many ideas, and so many ideas that you have developed throughout the years, not just in this talk. And we have questions prepared for you, which touches upon all these concepts that you've sort of managed to share with us: interdependency, gender. I listen to you, and there's something we talk with our students about: taking concepts seriously. Like, what do we mean when we say such a thing? What do we mean? I think you pointed that out, because we use these words all the time: justice, gender, women, feminism, right? And then when you actually stop and think, oh, what does this mean to me? What does this mean to my community? I think you've struck a very important fiber. And perhaps I would ask a first question relating to your reflection, because you've always pointed out, and you said so now, that we need to open up. We need to open up categories. We need to open up feminism. And I think one of the reasons we are very happy to have you is because we have to open up the university as well. And you are an academic, a very successful academic, and I would like to ask you, what does this mean when you're an academic? Because academics, you talk a lot about the bodies, right? We have our own bodies, and then we are opening up these institutions that have all this patriarchal history, right? Could you talk to us a little bit about that?
Thank you, Mariana. And I would say, sometimes we hear critics complain that, oh, the left has taken over the university, or the university has is filled with radical tenured people. They have job security. Well, nobody has job security anymore, but they have job security, and they indoctrinate students, or they seek to convert students to their point of view. Now, it seems to me that in a feminist theory class, for instance, when you ask about the question of gender, you open up a number of issues. Is it the same as sex? Is it cultural? Is it historical? How does it appear in different languages, if it does appear? And what about languages that have no place for gender? How do we explain that, right? So, but also, what is the relationship between anatomy or endocrinology, genetics, and a lived sense of gender, or an historically changing sense of gender? Is there a relationship between, say, science and the social sciences, or science and language, or perhaps that we need to think about, or perhaps we need to think about the language of science itself to see what is built into the hypotheses. In other words, we open up a set of questions without exactly knowing what the answer will be. And that's a sign that we are practicing open intellectual inquiry. That is what universities are supposed to do. They pose questions even when the posing of questions may be unsettling, may be difficult, may conflict with what we have learned from our family or our religious upbringing, but we do pose the questions. We give people all the time in the world to think about how they want to approach it. We don't say you must approach it this way. We don't grade a student in a good way because they agree with us. No, we do not do that. In fact, sometimes the students give us our best challenges, right? They're like giving us a very strong critique of what we have just taught. And that's a beautiful thing. We affirm that. We do, even if it hurts us, we affirm it because that's what open inquiry is. So what is really the case is that we are committed to opening up questions even when they are frightening or dangerous. But the very fact that that is our practice is what is called indoctrination, is what is called conversion. Or left authoritarianism, and it's because we have, or at least I have, apparently unsettled certain conventional ideas of what sex is, or what follows from the fact that you might be called a girl at birth. It's supposed to be the case that you stay a girl, that you get married to a man, that when you become a woman, that you reproduce within the context of marriage, and that the marriage is legally and religiously sanctified. And if you depart, does that mean you're not a woman anymore? Or does that mean that you're expanding the category of woman to include other ways of life, of living, and of loving, of relating to others that don't fit that mold? Now, I mean, there's lots to be said about this, but so I'll just be quiet because I will go on a tirade, and that will be not good.
Thank you very much, Professor Butler. Another question, Professor Butler, you have spoken about the humanities and the future of the humanities, and you have asked whether studying humanities is a fundamental social obligation that should occur in universities. You have also indicated that because of the present moment in history, universities should be required to become more open-minded. How can we promote the idea that we cannot learn about of our world in the if the humanities are not present? And since the universities are the place where the presence of the humanities has its potential, it's fundamental for universities to promote critical reflections on reality, gender studies, and the study of inequality, injustice, and violence. How can we ensure that these critical studies, which imply a gender perspective, permeate the disciplinary areas in universities to create a more inclusive, equal world?
Thank you. That's a very important question, and one that deserves a very full answer, which I think I cannot fully give, but I want to take this very seriously. well, as you know, and I'm sure you experience it, you are yourself at a technological school, so you know that technology is a very strong social value, and that throughout the world, technological institutes are supposed to help bring a region or a city or a nation into contemporary economic life in efficient and profitable ways. But also, of course, technology serves communications like this one. We're very grateful for your technology. And yet, I think when we come to questions of value, like what is the ultimate value? Is productivity the ultimate value? Is market value the ultimate value? What are the ultimate values? How do we decide on that? What's the relationship of market value, productivity, profit to other kinds of values like community or the preservation of the earth or substantive equality rather than gestural or empty equality? At such moments, the posing of the very question means we're in the humanities. We've entered. We're there. It's there. But when that question is shut down, then the humanities is also shut down. I mean, for instance, there's so many issues. If we take the question of evidence, for instance, how many people in the United States believed that Donald Trump did not lose the election, and on what basis did they believe that? What resources were they relying on to come to that conclusion? In a classroom, when somebody comes to us with a view like that, we say, so tell me, on what basis did you come to that conclusion? I mean, we may not say immediately that's totally wrong. We may, or we might in an impatient moment, but we should be saying, on what basis did you derive that conclusion? And then it's our job to show, like, reality can be presented in certain ways, but you need to test what that media source is saying against other media sources. Where would you go? How would we research this? What are the forms of research that give us a chance to exercise judgment wisely, to discern what counts as legitimate evidence, and to discard what is not legitimate evidence? And I had a kind of crazy feeling during that election season that I wanted everybody to come into a composition class, an English 101, to learn how to read closely, to ask about sources, citations, legitimacy, illegitimacy, authority, non-authority. So, I mean, thinking critically means not accepting everything that is immediately given to you, including my words, right? Go back and check, is this right? Is this not right? What would be an alternative? That kind of open discussion is what universities are meant to do. So the question of values, the question of evidence, but also I think that in some ways the sciences are also lost, or technology is sometimes lost. Like, what are we good for? The people at Facebook, like, oh, we thought our technology was absolutely good because it allowed for all this global conversation. And then it turns out that there are hate groups that are free to do their job on that platform. And now there's censorship towards other groups that might be considered politically controversial, but maybe should not be considered so controversial. And there are debates about what is right and what is not, how you read a tweet, how you read a message, how you evaluate it. So the entire world of evaluation is one that every science needs. Including, of course, under the pandemic, questions of life and death. Whose life? Under what conditions does somebody die? How do you decide to deny a bed to somebody and give it to someone else? Medical ethics, narrative medicine. These are places where the humanities enter into our life and death issues. I think that we need to also make clear that there's strong public support for the humanities. If you ask You know, how many people love poetry? How many people read novels? How many people debate philosophy at the dinner table, even though they may not call it that? I mean, we have to be able to show that what we do in the academy is actually linked, not just to the social movements I was talking about, but to the common concerns of everyday life. And that having these skills of thought, of writing, of argumentation actually illuminate our worlds and help us establish our ethical and political coordinates or orientation.
Thank you.
And listening to you, I think we, as a university and as opening up, and we need to, the humanities also gives us questions, but also gives us hope, right? Because you talk a lot about imagining different worlds, and I think it's part of the humanities also to do that task of imagination. And that has a lot to do with feminism, right? So humanities and feminists make sense because feminists are always trying to imagine, I think, a different world. And sometimes, like you said, we are uncomfortable in universities, and we are uncomfortable to people. And well, I just want to say thank you for being uncomfortable and for discussing these ideas with us, because I think it's part of change, right? And going back to your initial ideas and reflecting on this relationship between the universities, humanities, feminism, society, I would like to say that, of course, the university is society, and society is the university. And sometimes when we talk about ideas such as mourning, for example, that you mentioned in your talk, I was thinking we have mourned our own students, we have mourned our own friends, and we have, I think it's important to recognize that, that all lives are worth mourning. And I think, and I definitely agree with you, it is not the role of women to mourn. Perhaps if we care for people, we help people to mourn as well in many ways, right? But I would like to ask you, sometimes in a country like ours, mourning seems easily turning to despair, especially because we're young people are also listening to us, and sometimes I finish a class and they say, oh, I'm depressed, right? And it is sometimes my responsibility to try and end the class on a different note, right? And say, so to put it shortly to you, how to mourn without falling into despair.
Mm-hmm. Well, the quick answer is to mourn together. In other words, mourning should ideally, I think, in my view, at least, take place in community and with others. It's one of the terrible features of the pandemic that many people have been left to mourn the loss of loved ones all alone in their apartments or their rooms without being able to travel, without being able to say goodbye. And, you know, we have these technologies that substitute for the gathering, which is really important. And yet what we're learning is how much we need each other's company in order to feel, right? And also in mourning, one feels one's own sense of mourning this other, but one feels the other as well. And some passage happens when we mourn together. And we also lift each other. We are also alive together as we mourn, or as we sing, or even as we pray. And it's why I think it's very hard to work through a grief alone. What communities can do is embrace people who are mourning, and to make sure they get fed, and make sure they're sleeping, and make sure they're connected, and we don't let them be alone for too long. But this tells us something really crucial about who we are as social creatures, right? We are those who feed each other, who lift each other, who who look out for each other, this sense of community or relationality. And it doesn't have to be somebody I'm deeply close with. It can be the person down the street who has received an eviction notice and who has no place to go. I think that the mutual aid societies that have emerged through the pandemic, or the networks of care, even trans-regional and transnational care, are quite amazing, and it shows us that we are interconnected in ways that is not fully structured by the idea of the nation or the region that goes beyond those borders. So, you know, what grief can tell us is how we are deeply connected to one another, and that we are that kind of creature. If we thought we were just individuals who are self-sufficient, then we are undone by grief, and that's good, because we become more alive and more connected with others.
Mm-hmm. Professor Butler, feminicides are an example of reflect of our societies, fossilized by the patriarchal criteria of male domination and by naturalized structures of violence. And as you have said, all of this amidst an atmosphere of death and injury that reiterates that the victims are dispensable. The logic of terror reigns not only in public settings, but also in private settings, as the pandemic has shown. Given the descriptions that have become established as everyday forms of life, the task of transforming violence is complex. What proposals would you suggest by modifying these structures?
Well, there are several, but I think it is important to start with the family and with domestic violence, because in too many countries and too many legal systems, as we know, violence done to women inside the home is permissible to the degree that she is understood to be the property or of the man, or because the public believes it has no right to interfere in a family's business. And that kind of violence is then, it's approved, it's permitted, it's accepted, precisely when we build these barriers against intervention. So my sense is that networks for women who are battered within the home, or who are raped or threatened with violence, or those who are survivors who saw other women being battered or killed inside the home, that these networks have to become stronger, because only through the strongest network can women be able to leave homes that are deeply injurious to them. And it means having shelter and education and mobility and social support. It means all of these things being very strongly put into place. Governments should be funding that, and they should not be intervening in it. They should be funding that. But in order to fund it, it means to acknowledge it, and that would mean to acknowledge something about patriarchal violence in the family. And there will always be religious and heteronormative objections to naming the family or the household as a violent place. And yet many of us know that it can be, not always. You know, sometimes it's a beautiful place. Sometimes a family and a household is taking in people who need help, right? I mean, so it's not one idea of the family, but when the family is violent, when it is a place where murder takes place, rape and battery, then it has to be broken open, quite literally, in order to give refuge support for women who then can find their way, not as lifelong victims, but as actors, agents in the world. And that is very hard. I also think legal systems turn the other way on crimes of passion. Oh, that was a crime of passion. And that's treated as if it's a natural disaster. Oh, that was an earthquake. That's natural passion. We can't do anything about that. Mm-hmm. It's not covered in the insurance. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's not a natural passion. It's not a acceptable thing because everybody kills, every man kills on occasion or might kill on occasion when he's jealous or injured or enraged by something. So we need to deconstruct this idea of a crime of passion. It should probably be renamed as a hate crime.
Mm-hmm. And you've touched upon something that you have also reflected a lot, which is the state, the role of the state. You've talked about legal systems and funding. And I also am thinking about highlighting the importance of the collective body, right? The collective body. And this takes me to your discussions on the power of assembly. And mobilizing vulnerability. So I would like to pose a question on that direction. And you've talked also about bravery and the possibility to claim our rights through this power of assembly, through the expression of our collective bodies. And I think when reading you, I see there is hope in our political voice. So Dora and I have talked about this, and it is our impression that under this notion, there's an assumption that we have a state and that we have institutions to confront. And then I cannot help but thinking, what happens when those institutions are so fragmented? And sometimes actors such as organized crime reconstruct the notion of what is political building. No? As one of our feminist academics in Mexico has talked a lot, Sayak Valencia will say there's like a new macabre, a new monstrous way of expression through cruelty and body mutilation. So how can we talk about the power of assembly in this extreme context?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think sometimes assemblies have power to the degree that they petition existing state power for certain kinds of rights, for certain legal changes. But other times, an assembly can call for and begin to enact, with its call, a new set of institutions. So, for instance, we talk about mutual aid societies or informal networks that are there, feminist networks of solidarity that are there for women who suffer violence in the home. Those can be informal. They can also become over time more formal. They can become institutionalized. So the call that comes from the assembly can be a call to institutionalize. In other words, let us have this commitment, which means let us have an institution that embodies this commitment and does the work of providing refuge and advocacy for those who have suffered violence in the home or elsewhere. Similarly, I mean, at a certain, I look at Argentina or Chile or Colombia or Mexico, places where there's mass mourning. They're mourning for people who have disappeared, or the students in Ayotzinapa, a horrible event, or massive femicides, which are not. There are many events that produce a trend. It's not like an historical moment of the kind that when we can see who has disappeared when under a dictatorship. But femicides are a repeated pattern of life. It's a repeated pattern of life, and the opposition to it has to kind of slowly institutionalize. I mean, it can start as sporadic, but then when we come together and we demand that evidence be shown, that inquiries be made, that the results of the inquiries be transparently available to the public, then we are changing institutions so that they embody our values. And sometimes it means producing an institution where there is none.
Faced with the various types of violence experienced in societies like Mexico's by migrants, and specifically the violence suffered by women, you proposed generalized forms of resistance that on many occasions become political resistance. Although such resistance seeks to defend our rights, it runs the risk of being called disorderly, and it complicates the possibility of speaking up against injustice. The parresía you referred to in your book, Sin miedo, formas de resistencia a la violencia de hoy, without fear, ways of resistance to the violence today. The ways of resisting today's violence always imply the risk of greater injustice. How can we promote actions to stimulate with solidarity force such movements in countries like Mexico?
Well, of course, I don't want to fall into that old trap of being the American who tells you what to do. So that would be bad. We don't do that anymore. Well, some of us do. But I want to say, well, maybe it's romantic, but I think it says something. You know, there was a point when Ni Una Menos had so many women on the streets that they pushed the police off the street. In other words, it wasn't like a confrontation, oh, here's the police and here are the women. It's like there were so many that the police just no longer owned the street. They no longer protected the street. The women made the street their home. They were so safe on that street for that time. They didn't have men to fear, and they also did not have police to fear. Now, of course, especially under conditions of pandemic, many authoritarian regimes are saying this is a public health risk, or we need to take emergency measures to make sure that people do not gather inappropriately. But then we have to ask, which groups does that affect and which groups does it not affect? And so a certain kind of war is waged through the differential application of an anti-gathering rule. And of course, one of the hardest issues to face is when you do lay claim to public land, or you lay claim to public space, or even to housing, and the police come and there's a confrontation. You can end up in jail, you can end up accused of a crime, even though you are objecting to an injustice. And Erdogan in Turkey has just done that. The student protests have been called criminal actions on his part. They've been called thugs and terrorists because they have peaceably, non-violently objected to the destruction of academic freedom within the university. They want their university, they want their classrooms not to be propagating political positions from the government, but rather giving them a chance to form their own judgment on matters of common concern. And that is always there, and one has to know how to identify that logic. Okay, here is where a popular resistance becomes criminalized. And we've certainly seen that with trans rights in Eastern Europe. We've seen it with against Muslims in France, and we saw Trump trying to do it with migrants from Mexico. If they are interested in crossing the border like any other international person, they must be criminals. It's an invasion. So this twisted logic, this twisted discourse has to be exposed and resisted, which means also that there has to be a very powerful alternative media that can get the word out when people congregate in the streets. It's never the case that an assembly all by itself can make radical change. That assembly has to be represented, and its representations have to be distributed along with an analysis that allows us to understand what is truly at stake, and a critical analysis of what happens when struggles for freedom are called criminal enterprises.
And of course, feminism is one example of non-violent movements, right? Because it's changed the world in radical ways, in very non-violent ways compared to other radical revolutions. So I think that when we talk about non-violence, collectivity, feminism, there's also this process that you've also reflected upon of constructing the us and the other, right? And then perhaps my question is, I know we need to open up categories, yet there's this constant process of the state othering us and saying you're criminals, this struggle for representation and saying, who's who in this moment, right? And how can we approach this construction of community without being exclusionary? It's thinking that we can also be autocritical, right? And then how to confront it when we are being excluding. So this ambivalence of the definition of community versus the other. Can you talk to us a little bit about this?
Yes. Well, I think I am one of those people who believes that social movements have internal antagonisms, that we should not imagine that a social movement is a beautiful place where everybody gets along and has the same view. No. People are struggling over fundamental categories, whether to stay closed, whether to be open, with whom to ally, how to formulate one's terms, how to get those terms publicized. All of those are enormously important political questions, and we differ, and we have arguments. But you see, I also think that nonviolence as a practice does not necessarily come out of a loving, peaceful part of the soul. It's not like we're all just offering love in the face of hate. We're also very angry. We're furious. But we work with our fury. We work with our anger. We cultivate it, into a practice that wants to dismantle systems of injustice, but does not want to reproduce the violence that we are opposing. And that's a very hard line to walk. How can I, in all my rage, seek to dismantle institutions that are pervasively racist or terribly violent, like the US prison system? Abolitionism, as it's called, is about taking an institution down, but it's not a violent, it's destroying an institution, but it's not a violent destruction. In fact, it's the destruction of something that is violent in the name of anti-violence. So we need to be clear about that, and we also need to reflect that clarity in our practice. I think we should not be afraid of rage in the same way we should not be afraid of sorrow. We live both passions, and our politics emerges from both. But rage is not some immediate impulse that is bound to turn into violence. Aggression and violence are, for me, not quite the same. So even within the group, we can struggle nonviolently. We can be angry without it being violent. And that's also true of our oppositional practice. And I think it's an art form. It's a political art form. Mm-hmm. And it does not come easily. We have to work on it as we would trying to get a symphony right, or a painting balanced, or something like that. I don't know if that makes sense, but that is the way I think about it.
Of course. And it's a beautiful way of saying this is hard work. Our students that are listening to you, I'm really happy, because sometimes we see all these changes going on, and we see all these movements, and it seems as if it's easy. And I think you've very accurately pointed out that it is not this romantic thing. We have to face all these challenges ourselves. And you've talked about anger moving us. And I think that's a common sentiment within the feminist movement, especially today. And you've also talked about mourning and all these feelings and emotions which cross our bodies. I would like to, before letting Dora ask you another questions on this issue of nonviolence, I would like to sort of remind us in your collection of essays in Sin Miedo, we have been, there's this beautiful essay where you also talk about laughter, and you also talk about joy. And when you talk about political movements such as feminism, of course, we find so much joy in each other as well. And you see women confronting with their bodies these policemen, like you say, but you also see women dancing and singing. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. Well, Hannah Arendt has a concept of public happiness. And I think when people are coming together because they've endured terrible loss, or they've suffered an outrageous crime, or they have a desire to transform the world in a certain way, they share those values. They're not alone with their own sense of fatalism and pessimism. But when you assemble and you're in the grips of a passion like that, you're also creating that passion, and you're creating an event that is a joyous event. So you're already entering the world and transforming the world. You're not just calling for it to happen in the future. You're enacting the change, I would say, at the same time. Philosophically, I would say you're enacting the change for which you are calling. Right? You act like it's in the future, but you're also in the moment of bringing that future into being. So that is a kind of performativity, if you will, that I think is there with collective passions. Collective passions can be terrible. They can be murderous. They can be fascistic. We know this. Nationalists. They can be white supremacists. We saw that on the Capitol, and we see it in the US all too often now. So I don't mean to say all collective passion is beautiful. It's not. But it can be when it's linked to this transformation in the direction of a more complete and radical democracy, when freedom is extended and expanded, when equality is rethought, when justice is still a demand, an insistence, a strong ideal that people are living with and sharing. I mean, it lifts us from terrible despair. It's why we need each other so badly, not to fall, and not to fall into terrible pessimism.
Mm-hmm. Another question, Professor Butler. How can we promote the reforms that must be implemented in frameworks that are anti-authoritarian and anti-fascist, anti-racial, and which oppose oppression and domination based on gender and sexuality? How can we achieve policies that oppose to the precarious conditions in which increasingly more people live?
Yes. Well, you know, it's a big question and a hard one. I guess I've come to think over time that we need our radical social movements, what we call grassroots activism, that listening to people who are suffering injustice, we learn most about what needs to be addressed. At the same time, we need our alliances in the government. We need our alliances in international organizations. And we need solidarities with other groups in other areas. So a trans-regional and transnational feminism is the one that is extremely important, but it has to be one that is constantly in dialogue with the local, that's not imposing its ideals on the local. We see how that works sometimes with non-governmental organizations. They decide what feminist issues are the most important, and they go to various countries and tell them, these are your issues. It's like, no. So, I mean, there needs to be a greater mediation between the local and the national and international, but I do believe that many feminists right now, I would say Angela Davis and Françoise Vergès and many contemporary feminist theorists are calling for a transnational feminism. And I think one of the, and I believe that would have to take place on many different levels of institutionalization and non-institutionalization to keep it dynamic and to keep it honest. How that works with something called decolonial feminism, which is so important throughout Latin America, especially in the Andes, but also in the US and increasingly in the UK and in Africa. I think it's extremely important to think about that, you know. Does the decolonial work in apartheid South Africa? Some people say yes, and some people say no. But then you have a very interesting trans-regional discussion. So, you know, I can't answer your question concretely and practically, except to say that building the transnational frame will be really important, and it will also exemplify both interdependency and radical equality if it's done well. And it will also make the fight against sexual violence and violence against women and violence against trans people and all gender nonconforming people. It would make it into a very powerful global movement, as it's becoming.
We have been, of course, discussing a lot on post-colonial and descolonization and all this language of building, I would say like this, acknowledging that there's more than one way to construct knowledge, I think is a fundamental way to start this dialogue. And of course, coming from the university, in our case, learning to value other types of ancestral knowledges, which in our countries are so important, and I know in the United States as well, all these communities that have been teaching us how to relate to nature in a different way, how to relate to our bodies in a different way. And in my opinion, I think that's a first step. Also entering in this dialogue with colleagues from Latin America, from Africa, talking to you and you listening to us, I think is an important thing, building dialogues which are actually listening to each other, because of course, you know, we can read, and this is something that in the post-colonial, it's in Spanish, it's descolonizar, means like rebuilding the narrative, right? Rebuilding narratives, and also finding different ways to read ourselves, right? Not just reading theory coming from the North, as you know.
Exactly.
But and in that, I think this exercise of talking to you listening and answering, I think that's very important. I think it's part of the example of how we can start working and imagining transnational feminist alliances on an equality basis, and giving this example also to younger generations. And the chat is exploding. We have been trying to follow questions from the public, and of course, everyone, we have tried to perhaps not ask you the questions literally, but talk about what people wanted us to talk about. But there is a question that we have not touched upon, and I think it is important because it goes to the heart of this, of so many theoretical but also altivist ideas, and recognizing alterity, which is how can we include the notion of disability, the notions of these bodies that cannot put themselves forward on the street. This question is from a feminist, we say in Spanish, compañera. For me, Spanglish is a legitimate language. Since you understand some Spanish, we say compañera means walking together. So a woman that walks with us, but she's saying, when our body does not allow us to go into the street, how can feminists relate to these experiences?
Yes. Well, thank you very much. I mean, I think that disability studies and my own relationship with people who are disabled and work in this area is what led me to think about interdependency in the way that I do. There is a clip online, a video of me with Sunara Taylor, who is a wonderful author who writes on animals and disability and feminism and the earth. She's incredible. And Sunny, we call her Sunny, Sunara, but Sunny. She, in walking with her and seeing what her needs were in order to move, she's in a chair, and her needs for assistance, but also her capacity to do certain things on her own. There was this way that the entire built environment became new to me. Like, this road is not meant for people in a wheelchair. This sidewalk does not have the special curb stop, we call it, so that she could move up it. And drinking and trying on a piece of clothing, all these different moments illuminated whether the world was welcoming her, whether the world, the structure of our streets and our homes and our stores are thinking about the person who cannot move without some technological assistance. And it really made me reconsider what are the supports that we need in order to live. None of us lives unsupported. But disability studies, I think, has given us that idea in a very radical way. I mean, the other really important thing that I would say is that for a long time, feminists have argued there is no one form for the human body. There is no one form for men. There's no one form for women. We have these ideal forms of the human body as mobile or as looking a certain way. And these are deeply oppressive because the vast majority of people don't conform to the ideals of gender or the ideals of the body, of human morphology. So the more we open our minds to that diversity and the more we build environments that are welcoming to people regardless of bodily ability, the better off we will be. Otherwise, we are engaging in forms of exclusion and devaluing those lives, and that can't be acceptable. Mm-hmm. You know, as for going to assemblies, it's also true for people in prison. They can't go, and yet they protest, and they even have forms of solidarity within the prison. And it means that advocates are especially important. Some people work the media from a site out of visibility. I mean, I'm older, and sometimes I can't go to I can't go. I have an autoimmune issue. I'm very pleased, but I can write an editorial, or I can call people and arrange for their transportation. So, you know, the visible moment of the assembly takes a lot of planning and a lot of media and a lot of work that is not part of the gathering itself. We must remember that these require all kinds of people with different levels of mobility.
Professor Butler, do you believe that it's still pertinent to talk about utopia and hope, taking in account the realistic limits of the possible, and realizing that you have said that literature is where utopia is imaginable or feasible?
Yes. It is true that I think literature can take us out of the space and time in which we live and put us in a temporary world where we are asked to think about time and space differently. And as a result, we can, from within a literary text, look back on our world and see, oh, what a strange way it's organized. It doesn't have to be organized this way. We might organize it differently. So I do think that literature can dislocate us in order to relocate us, and that we can be transformed by what we read and bring that greater imagination to the task of reimagining the world and even possibly repairing the world. Mm-hmm. I don't know about utopia. I think if it's a static idea of an image that we're supposed to realize, I don't know about that. I think utopia is something we cannot anticipate. It might be the potential of what cannot be anticipated that gives us joy. Mm-hmm. And I'm against realism in general, because I think that when we are told to be realistic, we are usually told to cut back on our expectations. Right. Don't expect too much. The world is not going to change that much. Mm-hmm. Of course, it would be a cruelty to say, oh, you can do whatever you want in this world, because that's also not true. But I am in favor of what I call unrealism. That's not a word in English. Don't try to learn it. It won't help you in life. Unrealism, which is basically a refusal to accept the terms of reality as they are dictated by those who seek to limit the potential of social transformation. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
And well, speaking of transformation, and we are near the end of our conversation, a dear friend of ours, Margot Eckenberg, was pointing out to us that your first book is now 21 years old. And she says, Gender Trouble was published in the 90s. And so much has changed since your first book. And before we finish this conversation, we would like to ask you, because we've seen you, we've followed your work through the years, and we've seen your thinking evolved, and you're talking about imagining the world. And I think you've imagined the world many times, and you've shared that imagination with us. And then we imagine the world, and then in my experience, we come back to your books, and now we have the fortune to be talking to you about these these imaginaries of ours and your imaginary. And perhaps the question is, what have you held on to? What ideas have been crucial to you throughout these years? Just like that.
Well, I think that the truth is my first book was a philosophy book on Hegel, which was published maybe 35 years ago. And that Gender Trouble was published 31 years ago, although written 32 years ago. I wrote my dissertation on Hegel's notion of desire. And today I talked about desire and the life force and power. So I think those have become, they stay very close to me. The earliest work was on desire and recognition. And do we need our desire to be recognized by others in order for it to live in the world? And mourning is a way of recognizing loss, or recognizing that you have cared about somebody and lost that person. And I've been struggling to make, from the very beginning, lesbian and gay loves and lives recognizable and valued, and when necessary also mourned. So that was very early on, I think, that idea. And I was, of course, very shaken by the AIDS crisis as it emerged in the United States, where I encountered it. And I saw that many people lived with shame that they had the illness. And the social movement was very radical, and it was all about getting rid of shame. And it was beautifully done. We did it. I mean, they were a little older than me, but they really did change the entire culture and ended up changing the law. I mean, the idea that we have gay marriage now would have never been imaginable. And that's not for me the ultimate revolutionary position, but it is a significant achievement legally in terms of civil rights. So that's been with me my whole time. And I suppose that there's also there are less overt forms of violence that act on us through gender norms that can be very constricting. At the same time, I recognize that some people love their genders and love nothing more than to conform with their idea of what the norm is. So I've had to adjust myself, because some people love the binary. That's all they want, is to live in the binary. So good, they should live in the binary. It's just not all of us should have to live in the binary. So, I've had to adjust over the years and think more in more complicated ways about the relationship of theory to social movements and description of what is happening. And I would like to add, if I may, that my exposure to various Latin American feminist thinkers and activists has surely changed me in the last 5 to 10 years. I feel like it gave me new hope for feminism. So that's the other answer to Dora's question.
Oh, thank you.
I think we still have time for one other question. Dora or Mariana?
I think Dora has it, or would you like me to ask it for us, Dora?
Yeah. Well, I don't know which about her book.
Yes.
Let me see. Yeah. On the same topic of nonviolence, you pointed out in the force of nonviolence that an ethic of nonviolence cannot be predicated on individualism because we are relational, interdependent, and vulnerable. This is a very powerful reason for constructing an argument in favor of nonviolence. Yet, at the same time, nonviolence is very complicated to achieve, especially in contemporary societies constructed in which individualist constructs have prevailed. How can we transmit the idea that the construction of nonviolence implies links of interdependence and relationality, which imply equality and through which common good can be achieved, a framework of community in increasingly violent places and times?
I have two responses to that important question. Thank you. Well, first of all, when we think about violence, usually when we start having those conversations, somebody says, are you nonviolent? And the other person says, yes, I'm nonviolent, except if somebody attacks my dog, or if somebody attacks my friend or my lover or my mother or me. At which point the person is saying, I'm not violent, but I will defend all those who are related to me or those who are closest to me violently. So they're not really nonviolent. They're just making a distinction between those who are intimate with them and those who are unknown. Now, I think if we're to be nonviolent, we include everyone as important relationships, as constitutive of who we are, even those who live very far away from us or whose names we do not know and whose languages we do not speak. And to say that I value those relationships is to say that I will not, that to break that relationship, to do violence to another, is actually to break that relationship. And to break that relationship, even if I don't know them, I still have an ethical obligation to them. We live in an interdependent world, and my ethical obligation is based upon that interdependency. So if I do violence to somebody, I break my tie, I break my ethical obligation, but I also attack myself, because I am not just this person over here, I'm also my relationship to that person. I have refused to acknowledge that I am, as a living creature, bound to this other living creature. And if I attack that creature, I attack the bond between us, the relationship between us. And that's a different way of seeing things than individualism lets us see. Individualism, we are just separate people. I do something to you, you do something to me, but we have no relationship, except maybe a legal one once someone has committed a crime or enacted violence. But I'm trying to shift it so that we think about an ethical relationship that's primary, and that we do damage to that ethical relationality and who we are as well. So in attacking the other, I attack myself. I can't defend myself against the other by attacking the other. I am attacking myself, whether if I attack anyone. Now, it doesn't mean we shouldn't be engaged in acts of physical self-defense when we are attacked. We should. But self-defense, especially feminist self-defense, is a beautiful art form. It's a great art form. It's what I'm actually talking about, because you block that blow, you move that body off, you stop the attack through brilliant defense, and you move. It's forceful, it's not violent. Mm-hmm. Right? It doesn't reproduce the terms that you are seeking to oppose. And in the end, and this is my second point, perhaps my last, I think this is a question for the humanities, but it's a very basic ethical question, which is, what kind of world do we want to live in? And how am I either making that world or failing to make that world or destroying that world? But if I have an idea of the world I want to live in, then I have to act in such a way that it helps to bring that world into being. And that's where nonviolence comes in. It means even for those of us who are in the throes of anger and rage and murderous impulse, we don't kill, we don't destroy each other. We find another way to live with and through that rage until it can transform into something else. Sometimes it transforms into sorrow. Sometimes it transforms into laughter. Sometimes it just disappears into the air. But we need to live with our rage so that we have more power over it rather than less. But we shouldn't pretend that we don't have it. That's the worst thing you can do, because then when you will act very stupidly. Okay, I think that's all.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your clarity, your generosity, and your kindness.
Yes,
it has been a great dialogue. Thank you very much, Judith Butler. And muchísimas gracias a los más de 3,000 personas que nos siguieron por los diferentes canales del Tecnológico de Monterrey. Muchísimas gracias por esta tarde maravillosa y los esperamos muy pronto en estas jornadas feministas y con la presencia de Donna Haraway el próximo 23 de marzo. Judith, muchísimas gracias. We are waiting to have you with us presently.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Gracias.
Thank you very much.
Gracias.